Shabbat Shalom. It was precisely during these days on the calendar, in April of 1963, that Martin Luther King Jr. would sit in a Birmingham, Alabama jail drafting what would become perhaps our nation's most treasured literary and moral document. Together with Ralph Abernathy and about 50 others, King had sought to leverage an Easter season boycott to integrate the downtown stores of Birmingham, Alabama. King's nonviolent protest march only got a few blocks before they would be arrested and King placed in solitary confinement. While the letter King wrote, as you may recall from high school, addressed the scourge of racism, discrimination, and injustice, its ostensible audience was neither Alabama's Governor George Wallace, nor for that matter, any of the other perpetrators of segregationist policy. The object of King's ire was a letter that had been printed in the Birmingham newspaper signed by 8 local white clergymen, ministers, priests, bishops, and a rabbi, self-described racial moderates who critique King for his extreme, unwise, and untimely protests, outsider methods that could, in their view, precipitate violence. King's letter, in the estimation of so many, is comparable in stature to the Gettysburg Address and Zola Jacques. It's a cri de coeur against the leaders who are hypocrites against their own value systems. King takes his colleagues to task for their do-nothing leadership, having almost reached, quote, the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride towards freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice. King railed against those who remained silent behind the anesthetizing security of stained glass windows, predicting that, quote, we will have to repent in this generation not merely for the vitriolic words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. It was not just, as Heschel would later say, indifference to evil is worse than evil itself. Rather, it was that these leaders had failed to represent the very tradition, the text, the values, the ideals that they preached, that they taught, that their clerical calling demanded of them to embody. Did they not know their scripture, their prophetic calling, the shared insistence on creating a just society? I can think of no better way to mark the anniversary of the writing of King's letter from a Birmingham jail than to spend some time this weekend rereading it. What is perhaps the greatest smackdown against the hypocrisy of leadership, leaders who talk the talk but fail to walk the walk. Aside from the anniversary of King's letter, according to the Jewish calendar, we're in the midst of the Sphira, which means the counting, specifically the days between the festivals of Passover and Shavuot. If you're unfamiliar with the observance, also known as the counting of the Omer, it involves a counting of each day between our liberation from Egypt and the receiving of the law 49 days later at Mount Sinai, 50 days. This year, as many of you know, I'm urging each of you to count off each day with at least one phone call to a person who would benefit from a check-in, a modest gesture of social solidarity during this time of physical distancing. It is, by certain telling, a joyous time of the year, as our people, both ancient and modern, eagerly anticipate the gift of Torah. But what you may not know, what my misshapen facial scruff signals, is that according to tradition, this period of time is also understood by many as a time of sober reflection. The Talmud in Yevamot records that it was precisely during this time that 12,000 pairs of Rabbi Akiva's students died, felled by a plague. In many Jewish communities, despite the coming arrival at Mount Sinai, this is a somber time on the calendar. Weddings are not performed, and certain aspects of mourning, like not shaving, are observed. But for me, the most interesting and arguably most important aspect of the Sfira's mournful character has always been the question of why. Why were Rabbi Akiva's students punished as they were? What misstep, what wrongdoing, what crime did they commit to justify such a punishment? The Talmud itself only says, Lo nahagu kavod ze bazeh. They didn't treat each other with kavod, with respect. But over time, subsequent commentators have read into the Talmud's terse language, and a more fatal flaw of leadership is seen to be committed. Akiva, as you may know, was the greatest representative of Torah in his day, and his students, more than anyone else, were expected to be living exemplars of Torah. They were the teachers, the guardians of tradition, responsible for modeling behavior for others to emulate. But they didn't treat each other with respect. The gravity of their failing compounded because their behavior reflected not only a personal failing, but also a leadership failure to represent the very ideals that they were called on to embody. All the time, but especially during this time, prior to celebrating the receiving of the law, a person is expected to narrow, not widen the gap between what one professes and what one does. For Rabbi Akiva's students, it was the dissonance, the disconnect between what they said and what they did, between the talk they talked and the walk they walked, that resulted in their catastrophic punishment. There are, to be sure, many measures of leaders. The courage and charisma required to stand before a pharaoh, the empathy one must demonstrate to understand the needs of those one is asked to lead, the emotional intelligence necessary to instinctually respond to the demands of the moment, both unexpected and unforeseen. But from Moses to Machiavelli to Martin Luther King Jr., perhaps the most important, the most impressionable, and the most enduring criteria to measure leaders is the degree to which they do not just talk the talk, but also walk the walk. We are, wrote Aristotle, what we repeatedly do. It is by way of our deeds, not our words, that we rise and fall. A thought that undoubtedly once led Emerson to reflect, "What you are shouts so loudly in my ears, I cannot hear what you say." It is why of the three types of people whom the Talmud relates that God hates, the first is one who is echad bapeh ve'echad balev, a person who says one thing and does another. In other words, a person who does not practice what they preach. Such a criteria, I believe, helps us understand the enigmatic and seemingly unjustified death of Aaron's two sons, Nadav and Avihu, about which we read in this morning's Torah reading. None of the reasons offered by the rabbis, their arrogance, their disrespect they showed to Moses and Aaron, their licentious lifestyle or otherwise, fully explain their sudden and tragic demise. Their fatal misstep, if you will, was not any one thing they did. It was rather they had forgotten that their position called on them to represent not just their own person, but something much bigger. In their case, God. This is the only way by which to understand God's justification for their deaths. In Hebrew, Bikrovai Akadesh, through those near to me, I will be made holy. In other words, while everyone should aspire towards a consistency of word and action, it's a responsibility that falls especially on those individuals in positions who represent something more than their own personhood. Indeed, the close reader will hear echoes of our Parsha soon enough, when we'll hear of Moses being barred from entering the Promised Land for the misstep of striking rather than speaking to the rock. Unto itself, Moses' punishment and sin are totally disproportionate, and yet, in light of Moses' leadership stature, his misstep was sufficient to preclude his entrance to the Promised Land. There's a relationship, it seems, between the stature of leader and the expectations we may have for their behavior. A good leader tries to embody the best qualities of his or her organization. A good leader sets the example for others to follow. A good leader always puts the welfare of others before himself or herself. By extension, leaders that fail to show these qualities represent a failing not just of the individual, but of the ideal and ideals that that leader professes to lead. The consistency between what one says and does, the walk and the talk, that one does not expect of others what one does not expect of oneself, this is the measure by which leaders make or miss the mark. Examples from history abound in both directions: king and the clergyman, Aaron's sons, Moses and the rock. General Eisenhower, who famously drafted a letter of resignation prior to the Normandy invasion stating, "In the event of failure that, quote, any blame or fault attached to the attempt is mine alone." The stakes need not be life or death. The leadership of Derek Jeter was not merely based on athleticism and talent. It was his ability to work as hard, if not harder, than anyone else, and thus inspire others to follow, that made him the captain. At all times, but especially in times of crisis, the behaviors of leaders set the culture of those people and those institutions which they lead. And ours is such a time for every individual and every institution that contributes towards setting culture to speak and act in a manner befitting of the demands of the hour. Given our goal to flatten the curve of this plague of our generation, all of us, individually and institutionally, must comport ourselves accordingly and model the behavior we would ask of others. Given the social and economic stresses being inflicted on our social fabric, it's incumbent upon us all to adopt a spirit of sacrifice commensurate with the magnitude of our present crisis. It is simply not enough to reflect on the sort of public conversation we wish to see. Ours is an hour that we need to act according to our ideals, creating a consistency in word and action, and demanding the same consistency from all those in leadership positions. And for those who may be listening today saying, "I agree with you, Rabbi, but I'm not a leader. I don't run an institution. I'm not a bearer of culture. Your sermon, Rabbi, it doesn't apply to me." I'd ask you to think again, because no matter what context in which you live, no matter the scale, in your family, in your workplace, in your home, you are an exemplar. The degree to which you demonstrate patience, kindness, compassion, creativity, a collaborative spirit, a spirit of sacrifice, a spirit of transparent communication, these are all unspoken signals to those around. At all times, but especially in times like this, it's the smallest gestures that speak volumes, and each one of us have both the opportunity and obligation to be our best selves for ourselves and for others to follow. This past week, I had occasion to revisit a 2014 commencement address delivered to the graduates of the University of Texas by Admiral William McRaven, the retired United States four-star Navy admiral. The admiral shared the lessons he learned from SEAL training that made him the military leader he would grow to become. His speech that day went on to become a book that I recommend in full, but today I'll share with you only his first lesson. McRaven said that day, "Every morning in basic SEAL training, my instructors would show up in my barracks, and the first thing they would inspect was your bed. If you did it right, the corners would be square, the covers pulled tight, the pillow centered just under the headboard, and the extra blanket folded neatly at the foot of the rack. It was a simple task, mundane at best. But every morning we were required to make our bed to perfection. It seemed a little ridiculous at the time, particularly in light of the fact that we were aspiring to be real warriors, tough, battled, hardened SEALs. But the wisdom of this simple act has been proven to me many times over. If you make your bed every morning, you'll have accomplished the first task of the day. It will give you a small sense of pride, and it will encourage you to do another task, and another, and another. By the end of the day, that one task completed will have turned into many tasks completed. Making your bed will also reinforce the fact that little things in life matter. If you can't do the little things right, you'll never do the big things right. And if by chance you have a miserable day, you'll come home to a bed that is made, that you made. And a made bed gives you encouragement that tomorrow will be better. If you want to change the world, start off by making your bed. Friends, some people lead institutions, some people lead countries, and some people are just trying their level best to make their bed. But we can all lead. We can all live with a consistency of deed and action in the big things and the little things, improving our lot, the lot of those around us, and the lot of the world in which we live. It's not enough in the journey in which we find ourselves to merely talk the talk. We need to walk the walk, step by step, each one of us an embodiment of the ideals we profess to hold dear, slowly, courageously, and collectively, mending the world in such desperate need of repair. Shabbat Shalom.